Think about it. The belief in one God. It's an idea that has literally shaped our world, our empires, our cultures, everything. And, we tend to think of it as this sudden flash of insight, a clean break from a past filled with tons of gods. But what if that's not how it happened at all? What if the real story is, well, a lot messier?
And this question, this is the one that turns everything on its head. What if the very faith that gave us Judaism, Christianity, and Islam didn't begin with a solo God, but in a world that was crowded, vibrant, and full of divine beings? Let's actually dig into that, shall we?
All right, so our first stop is going to take us to a place that might seem kind of strange at first, because for centuries, the religious life of the early Israelites wasn't some big rebellion against their neighbors. Nope, it was actually an evolution from the culture they all shared. This isn't a story about a break, it's a story about continuity.
For a really long time, Israelite religion was basically just a local flavor of the much bigger Canaanite religious world. It's kind of like, it wasn't a totally different restaurant, It was more like a regional special on the exact same menu. They were sharing the same holy sites, the same ways of worshiping, and even some of the same gods.
So where was all this worship happening? Mostly at these places called Bamoth, or high places. And here's the thing you've got to grasp. These weren't some weird back alley shrines. These open-air sanctuaries were the standard, normal way for everybody in the area, Israelites included, to connect with the divine. It was just how things were done.
And if you went to one of these sites, you'd find all this powerful stuff. Altars for sacrifices, of course, but also these big standing stones called masabah, and these sacred wooden poles known as Asherah. And hang on to that last one, the Asherah, because they're going to be a huge deal later. What's absolutely wild is that biblical heroes, we're talking about prophets like Samuel, even Elijah, they used these exact spots to worship Yahweh. This wasn't just tolerated, it was the right way to practice your faith at the time.
Okay, now this is where the story gets really interesting. We're about to meet a goddess who's been mostly forgotten, but who for centuries was worshipped right there alongside Yahweh. And not just alongside him, but as his partner.
Her name was Asherah. She was this major Canaanite mother goddess. And here's the crazy part. As the worship of Yahweh started to really take off, she wasn't pushed aside. No way. She was brought right into the fold, into the very cult of Yahweh, often as his divine wife. For hundreds of years, for a whole lot of people, worshiping Yahweh meant you also worshipped Asherah.
And look, I know this might sound like we're just guessing here, but we're not. Archaeologists literally dug up this incredible inscription. It's a blessing from the 8th century BCE, and it says clear as day, "I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and by his Asherah." This is like the archaeological smoking gun. It's concrete proof that ancient Israelites saw them as a divine power couple.
And don't think this was just happening out in some remote country shrines either. The Bible itself tells us that a symbol or an image of Asherah stood inside the main temple in Jerusalem for a huge chunk of the time that Israel even had kings. This was as official as it gets. Okay, so let's pause for a second. If worshiping Yahweh and Asherah together at these local high places was totally normal for centuries, what changed? Something must have happened, right? Well, a new, totally radical idea started to bubble up, and it was an ideological movement that would end up shattering this entire religious world.
The change really started with the prophets. On the left here, you see what everyone was doing. Syncretism, just mixing and matching the worship of different gods. But then on the right, you see this new attack. Prophets like Hosea come along, and they introduce this absolutely game-changing idea. A metaphor, really. They said the relationship between Yahweh and Israel is like a marriage. And if that's true, then worshiping other gods, well, that's adultery. That one single idea completely reframed everything, and suddenly centuries of traditions started to look like a terrible betrayal.
But an idea, even a really powerful one, is just an idea until something forces it into reality. For monotheism, that force was crisis. A whole series of brutal political and military disasters would be the fire that forged this new theology.
So let's walk through how this actually played out. This timeline kind of breaks it down for us. It kicks off around the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, with those prophets pushing this new Yahweh alone idea. Then, fast forward a bit, and a king named Josiah comes along and turns that idea into violent, top-down government policy. And finally, the ultimate national nightmare, the Babylonian exile, forces the final radical leap into what we now think of as true monotheism.
Now, King Josiah's big reform, you got to understand, this was just as much about politics as it was about religion. When he went around smashing all the local Bamoth and yanked Asherah's symbol out of the temple, he wasn't just purifying the faith. He was grabbing power. He was pulling all the religious and economic control out of the countryside and concentrating it in his capital, Jerusalem. In a scary world with giant empires on the rise, this was a political move to create a single, unified state.
But the thing that sealed the deal? It was total, absolute disaster. The kingdom gets conquered, the temple is leveled, and the leaders are dragged off to Babylon. So imagine you're one of the exiles. How do you make sense of this? It looks like your God Yahweh just lost, right? The answer that came out of that crisis was just breathtaking. They said Yahweh wasn't defeated because he was weak. No, he let it happen as a punishment. And why could he do that? Because the gods of Babylon, they weren't even real. As the prophet we call 2nd Isaiah put it, besides me there is no God. That's it. That's the moment. The birth of absolute monotheism.
Okay, so you've got this brand new, revolutionary theology. How do you make it stick? How do you keep people from just sliding back into the old, comfortable ways of doing things? You build a wall, not with bricks, but with words.
Well, first, you've got to do a little celestial housekeeping, you could say. See, the old Canaanite world had a whole council of other gods, the sons of God. You couldn't just pretend they never existed. People knew about them. So they got a demotion, a big one. They went from being junior gods to being angels. Basically, they were no longer divine beings, just messengers for the one true God.
And the final, brilliant move was all about the books. The sacred texts that would become the Torah were all put together and edited after the exile. This collection of laws and stories created what scholars call a paper wall. It was designed to build a brand new identity by drawing a thick, permanent line in the sand, separating this new faith from its own past.
And, this analogy just nails it. Imagine a government deciding there's only one correct way to speak the national language. So they force it on everyone, get rid of all the local dialects, and then rewrite all the history books in that new, pure language, making the old ways of talking seem ignorant and wrong. That's pretty much what happened here, a political and religious project to standardize belief and completely redefine the past.
So what does this all mean? It means monotheism wasn't just handed down from on high. It was built, piece by piece, over centuries of cultural blending, conflict, political strategy, and finally national catastrophe. It wasn't the beginning of the story, it was the destination. And that kind of leaves you wondering, doesn't it? What other huge ideas that we just take for granted were also forged in some forgotten, dramatic history just like this one?